You are listening to the all-new FinTech podcast in partnership with dLocal, the show that goes deep into the stories, the challenges and successes taking place in the world of digital payments. I'm Elliot Gotkin, and in this episode, episode 3, Licenses, Regulation and the Hidden Cost of Non-Compliance. Here to discuss, I'm joined by Gabriela Vieira, Chief Legal and Compliance Officer at dLocal, and Jeff Lettman, Payments Compliance Expert and Co-Chair at the Latin America practice at Barnes and Thornburg. Welcome to you both.
Hello, Elliot. Thank you for having us.
Hi, hello, thank you.
Bienvenidos, since I believe you both speak Spanish as well. So look, before we dive in, perhaps it's worth getting a sense of the relationship today between payment companies and regulators, and whether regulators are a help, a hindrance, or if it's more like one big happy family, albeit with occasional teenage shouting and door slamming. Gabriela, I guess it depends on the market, perhaps.
Yeah, well, I guess I wouldn't define as happy family, but more as a continuous working relationship that, in my opinion, needs to be based on trust and transparency. I guess what perhaps make it very easy as well as when folks go to the market and talk to the regulators, they see them as a core stakeholder rather than an obstacle. So I also would not define them as an obstacle at all. We just need to understand what they are trying to protect within their jurisdiction, right? And with that, I think the relationship can come to fruition very, very well so.
I guess it's probably not wise to be criticising regulators that might regulate your business in various markets anyway. But Jeff, what's your sense?
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I think sometimes companies that are moving too quickly don't necessarily appreciate the full extent of the level of engagement that is necessary with regulators to make sure that there's a full dialogue, both sort of pre-market entry and then during the course of operating within a jurisdiction. So I agree with what Gabriela was saying. And I think the relationship between company, regulated entity, and the regulator is of paramount importance throughout the life cycle of a company's operation in a jurisdiction.
And so really, although we hear in some situations it's better to kind of, apologise later rather than to kind of ask permission. When it comes to regulators, one assumes it's best to ask permission first.
Absolutely, I would say yes to that one. Be very transparent as well of what the company is trying to achieve in that market, and details of the funds of flows and the activities that are being done in the country. Definitely ask permission first, or at least as well keep the regulator in the loop. If this is something new to that country and maybe the regulator is still seeing how things are going to develop in that country, even if it's in a sandbox environment or not, but keep the regulator in the loop as much as possible. But also accordingly to the level of supervision that the regulator wants to have, right? We have seen in countries where some regulators, they want to be updated in real time of more day-to-day decisions, and others are like only if it's a really significant milestone. So respecting the regulator ways of working for sure, but always leading thinking what would the regulator think of what we are building here. Is that in line with their overall strategic and concerns they want to address in that country?
And Jeff, when we talk about, because that's obviously in the title of this episode, the hidden cost of compliance, what do we actually mean?
Well, it's a good question in terms of what the hidden cost means. What I would say is, what does the hidden cost of lack of compliance mean, right? Because a lot of times when we're talking to companies that are going into a new market and trying to explore that jurisdiction, there's that natural tension that occurs between a commercial interest in moving quickly, versus making sure that the company fully appreciates and understands the new operating environment. And you get, a healthy dose of pushback when you're sort of waving the flag of compliance and the necessities of really understanding the new jurisdiction. And one of the pushbacks can tend to be, well, it's very expensive to make sure that we get everything lined up before we start doing X in a certain jurisdiction. And I think naturally for companies that operate in a multinational environment like a dLocal does, the experience teaches that compliance itself is not expensive, but lack of compliance is much more expensive. And I think companies that tend to take shortcuts and really start operating by just virtually planting their flag in a certain market without the right level of engagement and without the right level of understanding of the local sensitivities and the local regulatory framework, those are the companies that end up finding themselves in trouble. And the cost of that, both financially but reputationally, can be enormous.
And I suppose, I mean, you say, of course, we should more talk about the hidden costs of non-compliance. But I suppose when it comes to actual, compliance or non-compliance, famously in the US under the previous administration, the SEC was almost deliberately vague about compliance aspects when it related to crypto assets and cryptocurrency. So sometimes I suppose there are unwritten rules that people are just supposed to, or they're deliberately vague rules that people are still supposed to comply by, which obviously is not always straightforward. Gabriella?
Yeah, that's interesting, and I think this is why in dLocal we also value the boots on the ground, right? It's kind understanding what is between the lines, because it is, as you said, it's tough to keep in trend, especially if you're thinking about multiple jurisdictions. What is the underlying concern of that regulator, as I was saying? So yes, definitely, I would say that smart regulation needs to be somewhat written and well explained. That's not always the reality, but navigating those, it's also very common in all the markets and all the regulators, because also not everything can be written on paper because of the dynamic nature of it. And that's how we actually, from dLocal, we will absorb that complexity, right? By having people there that know the regulator firsthand and can also have very clear conversations, not only about what is written in paper and in law, but what is the general concern. I'm very strong about that with my teams, because some things are ambiguous for a reader that it's not within the context might actually be very easier to navigate if you actually have the context behind that comes with those interactions. So yes, I would say that those are, yeah, sorry, go ahead.
No, I was going to say, so having boots on the ground, as you put it, it kind of helps to perhaps reveal that which might be hidden to others. And I suppose, Jeff, in that context, it also kind of helps, obviously if you're working in that space as well, to kind of keep your ear to the ground, so that if rules are either accidentally or deliberately vague, that clients can still, make sure that they are in compliance with, if not the letter of the law, then at least the spirit of it.
I think that's right. And it's not always just a sense of vagueness, right? I mean, and I think Gabriella hit on this very well. The speed at which technology is moving is one thing, but the speed at which regulations and regulatory frameworks, particularly in emerging markets, is another. And so one of the real advantages to having local expertise, having boots on the ground, is in scenarios in which it's not always clear that we want to do X, so we're going to be applying for license X. I wish it were that clean, but unfortunately, license X doesn't always exist. It's often, license A, B, or C that have been on the books, since the 1960s or 1970s, but the licensing regime has not kept pace with the speed of technology. And the only way to really understand that, it's very difficult to appreciate that from 5,000 or 6,000 miles away. The way to appreciate that nuance is by having real experts that are in the jurisdiction, on the ground, that are day-to-day in communication with both the regulators but also other market participants to appreciate those nuances.
Right, because of course, companies can have pristine compliance policies on paper. They want to abide by all the regulations that are out there, but sometimes there can be a bit of a gap between the kind of theoretical compliance when you're actually entering a market and kind of what's what's written down on paper, and when you're moving money across borders in real time. So I mean, from a practical perspective, how big is that gap? What does it look like in kind of most emerging markets?
I can take the one. So that is very interesting. I agree. The policy and the theoretical part of the compliance framework can be very well defined, right? The big question is how that would work on the transactional speed, and especially when you involve cross-border payments, where sometimes abiding by one regulatory regime could also create some clashing with others. And you need to see the payment flow in every single jurisdiction that is passing through, right? You need to comply with all of those different regulations. In my experience, I think it's very interesting when you see the compliance policy on the day-to-day activity, but with the speed that the business requires. That's when the gaps might appear, especially also in exceptions, how people handle exceptions, because not one size fits all. So you're going to need to address certain specific scenarios and how those exceptions are handled. And I think it's very interesting. I think it's also where the culture shows up on those moments, how the teams escalate those processes. Do they understand the main reason of that control? And how do they actually can exercise efficient framework, even though the scenario might differ from what is in the playbook.
And Jeff, I mean, as someone who helps major companies navigate cross-border regulatory hurdles, when a merchant's compliance model does fail, is it usually because of poorly drafted policy, or is it almost always an execution issue on the ground, or again, maybe as we just alluded to just before, maybe could it just be the vagueness of the regulations in the first place, and so the regulators kind of at fault?
Yeah, my experience, it's very rarely a problem with the actual written policy or compliance of what's on paper. Sure, there are companies out there that are very early stages and have sort of immature written policies and procedures, and it could be a failing of that. But my experience is particularly companies that are operating in a cross-border space, the written, what's on the paper, as a general matter, tends to be quite clear and quite good. But the failings, when there is an issue, is one of two things. I mean, one alternative is it's impossible to prevent a bad person from doing a bad thing. So there is no perfect compliance scenario that prevents misconduct. But generally speaking, when there is an issue, it's as a result of a lack of culture or a lack of tone at the top of the organization. And the best way to assure that people are operating consistent with compliance policies and procedures is to have members of senior management like Gabriella and like others at the top of dLocal talking about how important it is to the C-suite, to the board of directors, to actually operate the company with integrity, and really proselytize to the company that everybody actually wins by operating consistent with the law and the spirit of the law.
Right, so senior leadership advocates kind of moving fast and breaking things, maybe not the best example, especially in the fintech space, for other leaders to stick to the letter of the law when it comes to regulation. But of course, Gabriella, one of the biggest traps for fast-growing merchants is assuming that if they've got license in one jurisdiction, if they're kind of compliant in one jurisdiction, it's really easy just to kind of copy and paste it to another. Why is it that financial payment licenses don't travel across borders, especially when expanding into emerging markets? Why is it not just simple, just to kind of copy and paste from one place to another? What's the problem there?
Yeah, I think from a very technical perspective, first, a specific regulatory permission you have, it's tied to a specific activity in a specific country. So even having a license on one country doesn't allow a company to do other activities beyond that license. If that, of course, these other activities also subject to license, but even more so in another country. So we have seen different markets using similar language and being able to kind of take an experience in one market to have more proximity to a specific region. But that being said, the regulators are different, they have different concerns, and they might have completely different expectations on how to address those concerns. So the same commercial objective might actually be regulated in a different way from another country. So doing that type of homework first, I think it's super important. And then you will find things that are more, they have more proximity than others. But yes, but a specific license is not like a badge of quality. It's an authorization for a specific activity in a specific country in the end.
Right, one imagines that it would be much easier for you guys if there was kind of like one uniform set of regulations, even if it was just regional for Mercosur countries or for European Union or for what have you. But Jeff, I mean, look, when merchants are feeling, immense pressure to hit aggressive milestones, effectively to move fast and not worry so much about breaking things, perhaps, what are the most common regulatory shortcuts that they tend to take? I mean, have you got some perhaps scars to kind of to share with us of examples where people have fallen foul?
Yeah. Unfortunately, I've been doing this for a long time, so I have a lot of battle scars, Elliot. Look, I think the biggest mistakes or the biggest shortcuts tend to be consistent with what we were talking about, which is, showing up in a new jurisdiction without actually doing the spade work that's necessary to understand both the sort of hard aspects of what is required to do business in a given jurisdiction from a regulatory standpoint, but also the softer aspects of what it actually means to conduct business in that jurisdiction. And I think companies that move too quickly don't invest the time to understand both sides of that. And I think the corollary there is a failure to really find out who are the right advisors on the ground. I think when Gabby was talking about boots on the ground, that cannot be underestimated. And I think, that may be a local law firm, it may be a local accounting firm, it may be a former, very well-established, well-esteemed regulator in a given jurisdiction, but figuring out who the right person or people are that have the gravitas or the standing within a jurisdiction to be able to interpret what regulators really want and translate that back to the company is absolutely critical. And I think companies that have really fallen down on the job are those that don't bother to take the time or invest the resources to bring on board those team members.
Any anecdotes, Jeff, that you can share? You don't necessarily have to name the company, but maybe one particular egregious example where perhaps they didn't do a certain thing and suffered the consequences.
I'm going to be careful about client confidentiality, but let me just say what I've just described. I think is very, very common in countries in Africa, in particular, and again, primarily because when we're talking about Africa, the regulation and the level of enforcement has, as a general matter, not kept pace with the developments in technology. So the regulators themselves are trying to keep up and trying to develop new regulatory frameworks to actually fit the new technology. And it's through no fault of anybody other than the fact that the regulation has failed to keep pace. And if you simply just show up in one of those markets and start transferring funds internationally, you inevitably are going to fail.
Okay.
The other jurisdiction where I think it creates challenges is India. I think India is a jurisdiction that is complicated by its nature. The regulatory framework is complicated, and I think many companies have tried to do things the right way in India, but the evolving nature of the framework there makes it challenging, and I think makes companies have to rely even much more so on local advisors than a lot of other jurisdictions.
Right, I was going to say, at least it keeps lots of regulatory and compliance experts in their job. Gabriella, look, I mean, regulators in emerging markets are we've heard a couple of examples of where perhaps they've not kept up with developments in technology, but often they're painted with kind of one of two broad brushes. Perhaps in the West, regulators are kind of either too bureaucratic, or they're kind of, considered too lax. I mean, in regions like Latin America, Africa, Asia, what do regulators actually care about the most there, and what are the things that global merchants completely misunderstand about the nature of doing business there?
Yeah, I think what I've seen a tendency in terms of emerging markets, and I think also in the global north as well, is that the regulator really cares about the business model itself and how it works in their country in practice. So I think sometimes people have a misconstruction that they are looking into an application process with, okay, I need to see that policy pack or that documentation, the checklist exercise. And in truth, they really go through the core of it and the substance as well that is bringing to the country. So they want to know that there is local governance and accountable personnel. I think that's relevant. People they can actually talk to and understand. And one of the things that it always surprised me, it's when I'm talking to global merchants that they haven't yet have a presence in emerging markets, and they have this common misunderstanding that the emerging market regulators, they are probably less sophisticated or more flexible, and they actually are not. So every time I go through certain requirements, I don't know, in Brazil about we need to register every unit of receivable that goes through the pipes, people get like, okay, wow, I never seen this anyplace else. And same thing goes in different countries, in different regions. We see very unique ways of ensuring that the local governance is being complied by the companies. And you can see the level of sophistication that it can go, and it can change from country to country. So for me, it's always kind of interesting when I'm trying to translate that complexity to global companies.
And are we seeing kind of any regions or territories kind of joining forces to offer kind of like a unified front? I mean, I was recently in Hong Kong, and there was talk about Hong Kong and Saudi Arabia kind of doing things together, for example. So I'm just wondering if you're noticing that in order to kind of, improve everybody's hand or ability to attract, new investment and companies, that maybe, they are kind of increasingly trying to ensure that if you are regulated in this place, you are regulated in that place as well.
Yeah, we have been seeing that in some regions, which is super interesting. We saw that, Europe, I guess, is established a bit of the framework with the PSD regulation. And then we can see in some areas like WIMA region in Africa and different regions that we see they're working together in the Middle East as well to facilitate the regulatory burden and being able to passport rights from one country to another. That definitely helps, let's say, starting and launching that region, and kind of unifies a bit the understanding of that region. I think it's a very valid way to guarantee the investments are flowing through a broader, let's say, geographic landscape.
Right. And I guess the other way, of course, to save yourself many headaches is to join forces with an infrastructure operator like dLocal that knows the lie of the land in many different kind of emerging markets and local jurisdictions. So I don't think we need to say more than that on that front. But Jeff, look, I guess the ultimate nightmare scenario is a company kind of being forced, a merchant being forced to exit the market because it's fallen foul of regulations, either by, deliberately, by neglect, or just kind of accidentally because they weren't clear or for whatever reason. If a merchant gets it wrong and is forced to pull out of a country post-launch due to non-compliance, what is the true cost beyond fines and kind of sanctions from that jurisdiction? What does it do to their long-term growth and reputation? Does it affect their ability to kind of go into other markets, for example?
Yeah, look, I think the most fundamental impact is what you've said, Elliot, is reputational. Right, the fines, the penalties are one thing, but it's very, very difficult to recover reputationally once the international press has picked up the fact that you've been exited forcibly from a jurisdiction. I think it's one thing to make a determination that based on costs and benefits, perhaps it's no longer worthwhile for yourself to conduct business in a jurisdiction. I think that's one thing, and I think generally international markets understand the give and take of that from a commercial perspective. But it's quite another thing to be asked to leave or to be exited forcibly from a jurisdiction, and whether it's shareholder value because your stock price has fallen precipitously, or whether it's just seeking a license in another jurisdiction and having that new regulator run a simple Google search and determine that you've been exited from a country, that's devastating reputationally and very, very difficult to recover from that impact. I think the other thing, though, which is the softer side, is just the level of trust that you lose with your stakeholders. And I'm not talking about the market. I'm not talking about other regulators. I'm talking about employees. I'm talking about senior management. I'm talking about board members who have very much put their trust and faith in a subset of the company to grow in a particular jurisdiction and to do things the right way. And when it's found that things have not been done the right way, that level of trust is broken and very, very difficult to recover. And I think that can have a very cataclysmic impact on a company's growth.
Right, it's very hard to put a price on trust. I guess I'm sure that was a slogan of MasterCard or someone. But I mean, Gabriela, for you now, I mean, how do you work with product and sales teams to ensure that compliance is built natively into the payment technology from day one, rather than being treated as something that's just going to slow down growth or something something as somewhat of an afterthought?
Yeah, I think the way is to get involved early on the steps, but I also think that compliance and regulatory only get involved early when we are also able to show the value we are bringing to the table, right? So I think with product is super interesting. We talk in the beginning when a product is being built or a segment addressed, how we should build the controls around that product, and also how to handle the exceptions within that process. And with the commercial team, we try to be very honest in the beginning in what is scalable, what is actually very market specific, and what needs some regulatory validation. I guess that what we have been doing a lot internally at the local is try to translate that we are not here to be a bottleneck on the business at all, but we do want to avoid growth being built upon incorrect assumptions, because then that has a price later on. And when collaboration is there, when responsiveness is there, so we do need to be quick on responding, analyzing. We can't have what we call internally paralysis analysis. So if we are moving fast and at the pace that the business need, compliance and regulatory, they're actually enablers of growth and enablers of scalability in that sense.
Right, and of course, I'm sure we all know the, I believe it's an Aesop's fable of the hare and the tortoise. So we know that being the fastest isn't always necessarily the best, or doesn't always get you to your destination first. But look, Gabriela, just kind of as we kind of move towards the end of this conversation, I mean, if you could give one defining piece of advice to global merchants planning their expansion strategy over the next 12 months in order to avoid regulatory pitfalls, what would that advice be?
Hire the local? No. No, I would
Aside from hiring the
yeah,
local.
right. So you see, I'm getting my time with the commercial team. No, I would say don't treat regulations as a market entry checklist. Treat it as a design. I think that you need to expand in depth. Yes, sorry, and not just speed. Get to know the reality before you build for scale, because otherwise you're going to be again building upon incorrect assumptions, and that can be devastating, I think.
Okay, and Jeff, final word from you. I mean, looking at how rapidly international frameworks are shifting, never mind with new innovations like stable coins and other things like that, which is a whole new rabbit hole that we won't have time to go into today. What is the one major regulatory trend on the horizon that merchants underestimate, but will matter big time in the next few years?
I think we've talked throughout the conversation about regulation catching up to technology, and I think that's very much the case. But it's not just regulation that's catching up to technology, it's actually enforcement of the regulation. And I think particularly for companies that are operating in emerging markets, there is an expectation that while we're waiting for regulation to catch up, the enforcement mechanism is going to lag substantially behind. And one of the things that we have seen, I think, over the last couple of years in particular, is countries are not just investing in upping their game from a framework standpoint, but they're also investing resources in developing enforcement mechanisms. And so, we are not talking about the Wild West when we're talking about emerging markets. It is very much the case that countries are investing in making sure that the regulation keeps up pace, but also that they have enforcement regulators that are going to be out there surveilling the market and looking out for actors that are not complying with regulation. And I think when we're talking about payments in particular, the area where I think is going to see the most significant growth is anti-money laundering enforcement. We're seeing that in many jurisdictions in Latin America in particular. We're seeing that in Asia. We're starting to see development of that more so in Africa. And countries and regulators realize that the regulatory framework is only as good as the enforcement mechanism is. And so I think we're going to start to see from many international regulatory authorities much more significant enforcement in anti-money laundering legislation and much more significant fines and penalties than we have seen historically from many jurisdictions.
And of course, very interesting that against that backdrop, with when you ask fintech founders or leaders about, what is AI doing to, finance and financial services, AML, kind of fraud prevention, are one of the a couple of the key elements of this ecosystem that they talk about AI being able to help. But I suppose just as it can help, with the technology providers and the infrastructure providers and the fintechs and the regulators, it can also help the bad actors as well to try to find ways around it. But that, of course, would be for a whole different conversation, which I'm sure we will have eventually. But for now, I believe we are kind of coming to the end of our conversation. So I really just want to thank you for I don't know where the time went. I want to thank you both for a really fascinating conversation, for sharing your insights today. Gabriella and Jeff, thank you so much.
Thank you,
Elliot,
for having us.
And for everyone watching and or listening, this was the FinTech podcast with me, Elliot Gotkin. If you like what you heard or saw, you can subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. And if you can, do leave us a nice rating and review. And you can listen to all previous episodes of the FinTech podcast via our website, f-in-tech.com. And if you've got any comments, suggestions or feedback, you can find us on X and on Instagram. That's it from me. We will be back again next time for more of the best F in Tech. Hope you'll join us again then. Bye-bye.